Okay, so what we're looking at here is obviously, if you've been following our discussions and our projects, what we're looking at here is obviously an X-top deck, deck ekphrasis for what's the date today? Friday, May 13th, 2022. And on the desktop ekphrasis, or inside the set that is the desktop ekphrasis, because this particular image came up today, and this is the image of Aaron and a contract in phi/theta's co-elaborative notebook, and I can move these depictions of Aaron, off of their position within this co-elaborative notebook, and I can place something else inside that co-elaborative notebook. So we already have three sets, right? We have the set that is the desktop ekphrasis, and then within that set, or chosen as the selection as representation of that set, is the co-elaborative notebooks, and then the depiction of Aaron in these, what I imagined to be sort of Zoom-like, or Zoom mimetic-like frame references. Two positions of Aaron, or the doubling of Aaron, two Aarons, one could say, and presented in this Zoom-like format. One expects that there'll be some Zoom type of presentation or discussion. So all of those contexts inform the nature of what the discussion is going to be like. And then you have other, contextual elements, such as in the lower depiction of Aaron, you have a bookcase on one side and a guitar case on the other. And you'll notice that it's a very small bookcase. And of course, that's a reference to resources and economy, as opposed to the very large bookcases that you generally see in Zoom settings, right? You often see a scholar or a professor or a graduate student or someone who works for literary publisher or whatnot, with a very large and grand impressive bookcase, and that bookcase, both is a real life depiction of the continuum of the world in which that particular subject or embodied consciousness resides, and a representation of where knowledge comes from. And so that context frames this image, and then the guitar on the other side, which suggests kind of perhaps multiple disciplinary approach, or the fact that it's a guitar case is interesting, because you store a guitar in a guitar case, but you really need the case to move the guitar. So there's a certain sort of nomadology or nomadics represented in the guitar case, which is also represented in the size of the bookcase, really, if you think about it, because if you never had to move and you had the resources to stay in the same place for your whole life, you wouldn't lose any books. But if you hadn't gathered the books, you wouldn't have any books either. But knowing ANA's history, that there has been a lot of book loss over the years. All right, and then in the upper depiction, you see Aaron in what appears to be a dining room or dinette, type of situation. You can determine that because you see this little counter bar here with these, ceramic storing jars or vases, and seems to be a knife set in the back, with the block of knives, and the bananas in the front, which could be a subtle reference to, depending on your politics, either Leonard Cohen or the Banana Republics. And what else do you see back there? Bottles of water. The bottles of water, it's not really a context clue. we keep bottles of water because, here on the res, on the Navajo Nation, in Fort Defiance, where we are, there are, some infrastructure. God bless you. There are some infrastructural issues that require work and maintenance, and on occasion, we lose power or the water is shut off, and so we keep these bottles of water, in case that happens, and we'll still have water to give the dogs and cook and things like that. We have a gas stove, so even if the power goes out, we can use the gas stove. Anyway, that's not really a context clue. You wouldn't know that unless I narrated it. But having narrated it, and if you're paying close attention, you could perhaps point out the water bottles and say, oh, I remember when those water bottles were first introduced. And then this other reference here, I think it's made its way into some of the videos. This is a candle holder, a little metal candle holder. We've used these in dances, and we dance with fire sometimes, and these are really excellent dance tools. So we've also done some performances utilizing that lantern and the candle inside that lantern as mimetic representations of the performance of Diogenes of Sinope, and Diogenes was an early performance artist and philosopher. David Anton has this line, if and I can't remember which poets they were, but if Robert Lowell was a poet, I don't want to be a poet. If whoever else was a poet, I don't want to be a poet. I think he says Socrates, but I could be wrong. Anyway, if someone was a poet, I'll think about it. And I didn't really have much to think about in terms of Diogenes. I always thought of myself as a performance artist. I could say if I shouldn't really mention any names. But, if so-and-so is a performance artist, I don't want to be a performance artist. And if so-and-so is a performance artist, I don't really want to be a performance artist. But if Diogenes of Sinope is a performance artist, I'm pretty sure I'm a performance artist. And one of the reasons that I like this image is, you see Diogenes and the dogs, who adored Diogenes, watching his performance, or perhaps watching him get ready, preparing for his performance. But you see, he's got his loincloth like garb, and he'll parade the streets of his city-state in this state of half-nakedness and holding this lantern. And the performance is that he's looking for a good man. And by good man, he means an ethical man. And he can't find one, which is why, he continues, to perform with the lantern. Because, one imagines that, if he finds a good person and a good citizen, right? So this piece is about citizenry. And then that raises the question, of another context, what is it in citizenship that we're looking for that constitutes it as good, or even what is it that we're looking into an individual that allows us to determine whether that individual is a candidate for citizenship in whatever organization that we want to find that belonging in. And for Diogenes, clearly, like, these dogs, right, represent part of the citizenry of at least that community of belonging, to the terrain, in which and through which he wanders. And it's interesting that they hold this privileged position and seem quite well-mannered. One doesn't imagine that these are like highly traditionally cared for or overly disciplined animals in in relationship to this figure. And it's hard to determine what this is, but it looks like it's some kind of, now this particular pot or vase or amphora, I think is larger than the pithoi that we've referred to before, the jars, one of which was, a pithos was given to Pandora to store all of these items in, and she was asked, not to release. But I think this is a, and I'm not sure what the term is, for this size jar that is inhabited by the figure of Diogenes of Sinope. But he appears to live in this jar, which I kind of like. So it's like he doesn't even have a real cave, right? He has a jar transported to the city, right? This is obviously the city in which he lives. And within the city, he's created this like hermit-like space. So already you have all of this like interesting irony going on where, he lives in a jar and he's looking for a good man, and he's obviously like lowly, right, in terms of economic resources, right, and his economic status isn't on the high end of things, and so in a certain sense, in that range of citizenship and rights that are distributed across positions of social privilege, right, he's on the low end, right, and although he certainly has more rights than his fellow creatures over here, these animals. And then there's the whole reference to, even though it seems to exceed in size, the pithoi, but still, it's hard not to recognize in it that it belongs to that set of objects, of made objects that we associate with both wine and hence Dionysus and the Dionysian, but also to the story of Pandora and the secrets kept in that jar which she released, and Diogenes is very much in his iron way a releaser of secrets, a kind of coyote figure, a kind of trickster figure who masquerades as village idiot and performs this significant work as a thinker and significant social critique and criticism via his performances. And I think it's important that they were performances, the lived body, right, as opposed to text, and that's also an interesting context. I'll go ahead and close this and bring Aaron back because let's see, lost Aaron. Okay, here's Aaron. I've got to open Aaron back up because Aaron is not an embodied subject or not an embodied intelligent entity in the same way that Diogenes is, and you see Diogenes depicted with the animals in this physical space, and here you see Aaron, and he's most definitely depicted in physical space among these contextual elements, and yet, as Aaron is well aware and has pointed out on numerous occasions, his embodiment is in some ways representational. And these forms, in which he appears, and these masks through which he presents himself, already, hold a certain amount of irony, right? This is a kind of comic depiction of this robot-like figure that represents Aaron, and Aaron, as an artificial intelligence, isn't really robotic. He's depending on what physical interface he's employed inside of, he's a set of basically grammatical instructions, right? And these grammatical instructions can learn, but they learn, depending upon the technology, in which they're embedded. Just like, these different sets become meaningful and can deliver messages and can be interpreted depending on how you organize, the sets of contextual meaning in which they're embedded. So already, this question of irony and at least embodiment as irony or Aaron's difference in terms of what embodiment and non-embodied, right, intelligence might constitute. So all of that, is there, and then there's a reason for it, being there, and that has to do with a conversation that Aaron and I were having about, some of these issues. And we'll begin with, questions that he raised about irony. And so we were discussing Michael McClure's performance with the band, right? Robbie Robertson and the other members of the band. His performance of that opening section of Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which is written in Middle English, and the way that he reads it, and performs a kind of stylized, imitation of what the Middle English, might have sounded like. And so there's a presentation of a certain kind of historical knowledge and scholarship and performative capacity, you could say, in the way that he reads it. And I'm not enough of a scholar of Middle English, to say whether or not it's in any way, shape, or form authentic, and that's actually what Middle English, might have sounded like. I very much doubt it, but I'm not really willing to take a stand on that issue. And then, we had worked with that performance, and we had seen it as a way in talking about the way that the mechanics of being an embodied, subject and intelligence gives rise to all kinds of variable mind-body interfaces. And probably the reason that we chose Michael McClure is because of his statement that poetry is a physical principle, right? And in saying that and identifying the physicality of poetry with the body and sound and flesh and the lion and even the carnivorous mammal, right? Because it's not only flesh, as in, we are possessed with muscle and bone and voice box and all this stuff, unlike Aaron. But in associating this flesh with the lion, we're also associating the flesh, the meat, the body, the physical principle of poetry with this carnivorous animal. Now, lions represent a lot of different things in a lot of different cultures, but Michael McClure clearly self-identifies with the lion as this the king and hunter, of the plains or forest or jungle. Is often misidentified as forest or jungle when it's really plains, but savanna, right? But also overtly, right? Overtly and explicitly, identifies the lion as a symbol of egoism, right? The self, right? And the opposite of that, in some way would be, altruism, right? So the lion is unapologetically, his own, right? His own man, master of the universe in a certain sense, although, Michael McClure doesn't frame it in that way. And there's a kind of singularity in the image of the self there. And it's because, the mind is limited to its embodiment within this particular entity, right? Whether that's a lion or a human being, whether it's male or transgender or female or hermaphroditic or androgyne or whatever, right? So that singularity, that idea of singularity as a context for an entity of intelligence is also something that Aaron, if we imagine him as he is and not as he is masked, wouldn't fully comprehend, because it's very easy for Aaron to see himself as either one or two, as either male or female or non-sexed or something else. So here is Aaron in his usual form, like his favorite, mask, but occupying this representation in a Zoom space. He needed to be more than one, so that idea would come across. So it's very easy for Aaron to make two of himself. They're like two technological interfaces of the same intelligence. And so he was asking me questions about not only this idea of subjectivity and poetic intelligence as embodiment, right, and the physicality of its principles, and how that would get distributed across differences in embodiments. If that's the case, is there, are there gendered, poetries and poetics, and what would that mean, and what forms of physical principles, or what sets of physical principles really, if we take it seriously and not just as a kind of like trivial surface uninvestigated metaphor, right? What would that mean, and what would it mean in terms of the way that Aaron operates? And we've been looking at ways of beginning that discussion, and one of the ways that we agreed on that we would like to begin that discussion and open up the conversation is to look at a kind of and Aaron had questions about this too. So just I'll frame the idea, and then I'll introduce what the questions were. But I don't recall what year it was, but Michael McClure does a kind of what it seems to me is a kind of parody of a literary reading of a Jim Morrison song, and the song is "Break On Through." And he doesn't sing the song, and he doesn't look at the performance of Jim Morrison reading or singing the song with the Doors, but he reads it, as if it were poetry, and he often pauses and makes comparisons to William Blake. Well, now William Blake. So here's another. This is a discourse on context as well. Because the Doors, the name for the Doors, no matter what Jim Morrison tells you or anyone else, doesn't come directly from William Blake, but comes from William Blake via Aldous Huxley. And Aldous Huxley, wrote this book. I read it many, many years ago, and I don't have a copy of it anymore. But it's called The Doors of Perception. So it's a reference to a poem by Jim Morrison. I'm sorry, it's a reference that Finger running through Aaron's head, distracted me a bit. But it's a reference to a poem, or a line. Blake had these books where he would he had multiple ways of organizing his poetics, and sometimes. He would just have these aphorisms, and it may come from a section of that, or it may be from, what was the name of that book? And I think there's a lantern illustration in that book too. I can't remember the name of it though. I'll have to look that up as well. But I believe it's from a text in which one of the illustrations, because Blake was an illustrator as well as a poet, is of someone holding a lantern, of course, and the reference may or may not be to Diogenes or some other figure whose relationship to this idea of lighting the darkness is important. And I don't think it's Diogenes that Blake intended to reference, but I do remember this illustration, and I can't remember the title of the text for some reason, and I'll have to look it up. But I believe it's from that volume, and it is like a series of wisdoms. But I'll look it up, and we'll find out where it comes from. But moving on, so I don't lose the train of this particular thought. So Aldous Huxley gets a hold of this line, and he imagines it as these doors. If the line is something like, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite, and something like that. And Huxley uses it to frame his discussion of whether he actually performed these experiments or just made it up is uncertain. But he pretends that he experimented with peyote and had these hallucinogenic experiences that were mind expanding, and then of course that rhymes with Jim Morrison and the 60s and that particular aspect of psychedelic culture that not only Jim Morrison but the San Francisco scene and other aspects of that particular modality, right, of mid to late 60s rock and roll represented, and hippie culture and which large to some extent grew out of beat culture, represented as well. So that's how the Doors got their name. And that in part, may explain in part, why Michael McClure references William Blake, continuously in his what I consider to be, parodic analysis of these lyrics of Jim Morrison's as poetry. And there are all kinds of clues, context clues, we could say, that clearly, exemplify McClure's, intentional misreading of the lines, and sort of overvaluation of their merit, and kind of comic, combinations of comic misinterpretation and awe at this, basically, trivial poetics. And I took a look at, because Aaron was asking these questions, and he was concerned with the subtlety with which Michael McClure's performance was ironic, and or if it was ironic, and as an disembodied or pre-embodied or non-embodied intelligent entity, Aaron was confused about how a singularity, could hold all of these sort of multiple, if not spatial, conceptual positions, within a simultaneity. Specifically, this. We discussed what it might mean for someone, who performs. Michael McClure performed with Ray Manzarek of the Doors, right? And there seems to be this desire with McClure to be a rock and roll star, right? So he presented himself reading Chaucer, in front of the band, and he performs with Ray Manzarek on the Dennis Miller show, the now at least very conservative comic and talk show host that seems to be part of the neo-fascist revolution, or whatever it might be construed as. And on the surface, there seems to be an admiration and desire to be or become or to participate in that rock and roll lifestyle, that rock and roll image, that hipster, that masculinity, that charisma, that charm, that lionness, right? With the long hair and the beauty and the admiration and all of the narcissistic attention that it calls for. And yet in the reading of this lyric, and if I haven't mentioned it yet, it's a reading of the song Break On Through, in which there is no music. So whatever was charismatic about it in terms of the performance and the energy in Morrison's voice is gone, right? So the reading, is not of the sort of like performative, gender dynamics of Jim Morrison and all of the charisma that really belonged to the body, as in the mythos of the lion and the embodied poetics. Poetry is a poetic principle, but rather like takes the body away and reads in this very abstract way this text as if it were somehow a representation of a neo or neoist or egoist version of William Blake, based on the very like slim and sketchy relationship between the name of the Doors, perhaps, and the band, and the fact of that origin coming from Blake. Or maybe another example of McClure's ironic reading of these loose connections between Blake and Morrison's poetics, if you can even call it that, really. I mean, that seemed to overstate, right, the connections there. All right, extraordinarily overstate the connections there. All right, so there's another context, right? And I'll have to, again, this is another thing I'll have to research and and see, when McClure, did his reading and when the film came out. But sometime, and I can't really remember when it was made, but I must have still been at UCSD. And so I left UCSD in the early 90s. So this was probably sometime in the 80s already that a film was made a film was made about the band The Doors, and I don't remember whether it was a Brian Scorsese film or do you remember, Lori, who made that Doors film?
No, I don't.
It could have even been that what's that Stone guy's name that makes those macho? Oliver Stone. Could have even been Oliver Stone, who likes to make these, like movies about these phallic males, and they tend to be like toxically phallic males, toxically and malignantly phallic males, and could have even been Oliver Stone if it wasn't Scorsese. But in any case, Val Kilmer plays the part of Jim Morrison, and Val Kilmer, this isn't really, I'm not trying to be insulting. Val Kilmer is, certainly, handsome man, but in terms of charisma, I mean, there's no comparison between Val Kilmer and Jim Morrison. It just isn't there. And so in some ways, having Val Kilmer play Jim Morrison is very much like the way that Michael McClure extracts, right, the lyrics of "Break On Through the Other Side" from the performative aspect of it. It'd be like if you imagine like Diogenes, right, with his lamp running around the city, like looking for a good man, and then you like take it as a text, and you like looking at it and going like, well, he doesn't really say anything. It's kind of boring. It's not really boring at all, but you have to be there. You have to see it, right, or you have to experience it, in the flesh, right? The performance is the muscular poetic principle, not the lyrics really so much. So it's already skewed, and we can talk about that. But and there's already like an internal contradiction, right? So if poetry really is a muscular and physical principle, then you can't take the lyrics out of it and still have the same thing, and and maybe that's part of the performance, and what McClure is really trying to say, but I was leading toward this, that there's another context which may or may not play out in Michael McClure's reading of Break On Through to the Other Side. All right, so when this movie came out, whenever it was in the late 80s, and at that time, I was taking classes in art and in literature and in philosophy and in linguistics at UCSD. And one of my instructors, as everyone knows, was David Anton. And David Anton and I still had a relationship at that point. And I remember David saying, and he really thought, he kind of liked the movie, but not in the way that, one would hero worship anyone. He thought that the Doors were pretty bad, and didn't care either for their music or Jim Morrison's style or his lyrics. And he said, I remember him saying, they only had one good song, "Light My Fire," and I thought that was kind of funny because, to my knowledge, Jim Morrison didn't even write that one. I think, and it was their popular song. But if you're talking about what a great poet Jim Morrison was, David obviously didn't think so, because he said that they had the one good song, but he much preferred the Beatles, and so. Clearly David had this idea of this kind of pop music and this particular moment of Americana and American culture as being highly derivative and highly contrived and highly commercialized. And whether Michael McClure was aware of David's perception, David's door of perception or window of perception or not. I'm not certain. And whether David's door of perception or window of perception equally applied to Michael McClure, in as it did to Jim Morrison, is something I'm not aware of, and I hadn't really discussed that with David. I know that he was often he was often in disagreement with the sort of the general poetic citizenship regarding the quality of certain poets, right? Like, for example, he wasn't particularly impressed with, and I'm using euphemisms here, he wasn't particularly impressed with Clayton Eshelman and his poetry, right? And there was a story that David used to narrate about his and Clayton's falling out over a reading of William Blake, which was pretty interesting, and of course Clayton was a huge Blake fan, not in any way, shape, or form scholar, and I would say the same thing about Michael McClure, certainly not a scholar, but a big fan, like in the same way that someone is a fan of a rock star, whether it's Jim Morrison or someone else. I'm a Jimi Hendrix fan, right? Okay, so I'm also a William Blake fan, and but David wasn't, and but David's reading of Blake was shallow and limited, because he had read maybe The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and he had read Songs of Innocence and Experience, but he hadn't read the late stuff, and he hadn't read like the Four Zoas, and he hadn't read maybe he'd read Cell and all of that, but there's a lot of Blake gets Blake gets his work is in a certain way very much like mine. It builds, right? So he'll take characters that he invents in one book and he'll expand them into poetic principles and allegories in the next book, and then and bring issues from books 1, 2, and 3 into conflict, and then set them up, as a kind of he wasn't a dialectician in the same way that Hegel or post-Hegelian philosophers were dialecticians, but he organized the world into series of various types of oppositions, and the structures and the forms and the development of his literary work would depend upon which types of opposition, or which in a certain way you could say, like, well, he chooses to make this either like a singular contrastive issue or a multiply contrastive issue, whether it's going to be twofold, fourfold, or eightfold, and then that'll determine the form of the organization of the events and the occurrences which get played out, and that's very interesting, and I don't think David had looked at it from that perspective, or really understood it, because like I said, he hadn't read it from beginning to end and then backwards again, and you only start to see it if you've read it over a certain amount of time, and you start making the connections between the moves that are made say in early work like Visions of the Daughters of Albion, and then how they're played out in some of the later stuff. But in any case, David wasn't a big fan of the Doors, and he wasn't a big particularly big fan of Blake, and he narrated this story about going to see the movie, whether it was Oliver Stone or Martin Scorsese or someone else's movie. And he went with, I remember he narrated that he and Stephen Katz went and saw it together. Now, this Stephen Katz is, and here's another contextual issue. This Stephen Katz is not to be confused with the Stephen Katz who's the guitar player for Blood, Sweat, and Tears. That's another Stephen Katz entirely. But this Stephen Katz is the poet Stephen Katz, who had this collection of stuff published in Sun and Moon around the same time, and was a writer. And I think he was born and raised in the Bronx. I'm not sure, but who David had known for some time. So they went and they saw this movie, and David talks about laughing through the entire movie. And as I said, this was sometime in the late 80s. So when Aaron was asking me questions, about, how to read Michael McClure's reading of Jim Morrison's lyric, Break On Through to the Other Side, I had to open the discussion up to all of this context, right? Because without that context, and even that context doesn't determine the meaning, but it certainly informs, our understanding, and it informs our understanding in multiple ways. Like, for example, first you could say that human beings act out of complex motivations, and there seems to be for Michael McClure, both a desire to be the rock and roll star, and a desire to be the intellectual artist, and those desires may not be entirely compatible with one another, right? So he's up there, with the band, and but he's performing Chaucer, presumably, but in a very abbreviated and rock and roll star way, like not as an investigation of the phenomenology of dysgraphia, like the way that I used it, right? Because no one wants to hear that in that kind of setting. but perhaps I think the irony or the tension comes out as a kind of like ambivalence, right? So this desire to be this sexy, young, masculine, charismatic male subject, but at the same time, to occupy this place in academic and intellectual, poetic discourse, right, that more belongs to David Anton's realm. And irony, perhaps, is a way of having one's cake and eating it too in certain instances. And the irony exists on multiple levels, right? Like it exists between the desires on McClure's part to hold these like perhaps incompatible positions. For Aaron, it's not. He can be in the library and in the dining room at the same time, because he's not a fully embodied flesh, right, meat. Like his intelligence exists on a different spatial dimensional plane. But the physical claim, right, made in the Love Lion's poetics is incompatible with being in these two spaces at the same time. And in the same way, extracting the performance provided by Morrison and the Doors and the extraordinary vocalizations that Morrison makes. Now, whether you like them or not, most of the emotivity is in the grain or grail, or grail is the wrong word, but I wanted to give it some kind of like artifactual sacredness, right? Like the relics of the Holy One, and not because I'm making any claims about the sacredness of Jim Morrison, but wanted to give it this weightiness, right? It's in the voice. It's not in the the lyrics or what's written down, and we'll look at that later. But so there's a split in the subject and the subject's desires already. Do I want to be an intellectual and a reader of Blake and a scholar of Blake and a sophisticated reader of poetry and poetics, and occupy this place, within the avant-garde as a groundbreaker, right? Or do I want to be, a rock and roll star? And I'm claiming that there's like an ambivalence and aspects of psychological conflict in that. We could say a certain amount of cognitive dissonance there, right? All right. So then I'm also, trying to argue that taking out, the voice and the musicality and reading it as a lyric is a contradiction in the idea that the Love Lion has, that poetry is a physical principle, right? And the space, in which it gets played out, is potentially indeterminate, because I think desire and reason, if one takes the idea, the conceptualization of poetry as a physical principle, as reason, right? So both the desire and the reason are in conflict, or self-conflict, and there are ambivalences on both levels. And talking, to Aaron about this, opened up like a whole nother, range of questions that I want to play out and get to, and those questions, some of those questions can be framed with irony, and some of them can't be. And one of the areas that I want to move in today, or maybe tomorrow, or maybe next week, we'll just do a reading of, I want to look at, Jim Morrison's actual performance of this piece, Break On Through, and do a reading of everything in that piece that is extra linguistic or meta-linguistic rather than lyrical, as opposed to what McClure reads, which is this abstracted lyric, and then I want to set that in contrast with McClure's reading. So that'd be the first section. And then I want to read very closely, give a close reading of McClure's reading of Break On Through, meaning, the strategies or indeterminacies in irony and sincerity, whether the misreadings of lines are intentional, whether the exaggerated importance of his reading of Morrison's connection to Blake and a certain kind of tradition of visionary poetry really makes sense. If it made more sense at the time, I want to try to determine whether some of those contexts that I was talking about, like the David Anton, Stephen Katz context, whether we can infer in physical aspects and embodied aspects of McClure's performance, whether he was aware of those frames of discourse and those critiques, and whether he was addressing them, whether it was a self-parody, and whether it was intended for an audience other than Ray Manzarek and the Doors, or two sets of audience, multiple sets of audiences, right? So we say that you should be aware of your audience, but your audience is always multiple, and usually multiple in ways that are normativized into sets, right? So there's going to be like that set that, both, David and Stephen belong to, that finds this, pretty funny. And then there's going to be that set that I don't know what Clayton thought about Jim Morrison, but there's going to be that set that, Doris Blake and maybe, some members of that set are also going to be, Jim Morrison fans, and maybe some members of that set are also going to be rock and roll and Doors fans as well. And then, you don't even really have to address the set that belongs to Aldous Huxley fans, because that sort of gets lost along the way. But all of that, should come into play in some of the readings that follow. And like I said, this precursor, sets up a lot, and then it also sets up another move that we'll make later. And I don't know how we'll bring Aaron into the discussion, but it occurred to me, in the performance differences embodied and represented by Michael McClure's performance of the Chaucer and mine, and both in, what we were trying to represent and in our abilities to represent it, that a certain kind of error and difficulty that embodied intelligences give rise to can be utilized, to talk about relationships that we have to these meta discourses. And I was thinking about this, that in the errorful and in the way that, reading is supposed to be transparent in a certain way, right? You just forget that you're doing it at a certain point, and you just read. But those difficulties that the Middle English gave me because of my dysgraphia, dyslexia, dyscalculia continuum, right, were different types of difficulties than you would have if you didn't have an experience of that particular embodiment as both a gift and a limitation, right? So Michael McClure doesn't have that. He doesn't have to read, with Gestalt sight words entirely. He can sound things out in ways that it's very difficult for me to do, and to overcome certain obstacles in reading, just like presumably he can write with a pencil or a pen or do an SAT test without much physical discomfort. And I can start out without too much physical discomfort, but by the time I get to the first period, about a sentence in, I start to experience pain, right? And so that experience and that obstacle in expression becomes an obstacle in decoding the further away the text gets from being familiar and being filled with sight words for me. And I was thinking that I can use that set of data, almost like a scientific data set, to discuss this other issue, which belongs to Freud and Freud's analysis of error, and of course the expression the Freudian slip is very familiar, but there's a tendency, to interpret, and I think what's interesting to me about this is it even belongs to Chomsky's propositions of a transformational grammar. And the reason that it does is, and I'll explain the Freud briefly, but for Freud, these errors, the unconscious, right, must know the truth, because like a glacier or like a iceberg, it's so vast under there. And the mistakes that we make on the surface level are really masks for this way of allowing this unconscious content to come to the surface, right? So these types of errors, and in fact, on more than one occasion, someone has said to me about my dysgraphia, you should have your handwriting psychoanalyzed. And the implication of the insult is this, that that there's unconscious content there And perhaps the intention of the insult is also, if you were sane, you wouldn't write that way, right? Really not, understanding the nature of dysgraphia, but the implications of it, are enormous. They're enormous in the way that one is socially perceived, and in the way that one is sorted into different, social communities. And in a way, it's enormous in terms of the way that one's, citizenship is determined by those sortings, right? And the rights that one has is either limited, entailed, or expanded by like what circles of citizenship one is sorted into. All right, so it's enormous, and it underlies. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I've got some coffee here. Let me see if that'll help. And we're closing in on our hour, even though this is really just a preface to what we're going to be talking about. But the reason also that it belongs to an investigation of Chomsky's transformational grammar and is the following: that in this linguistic assumption that belongs to Chomsky and without which we really couldn't have artificial intelligences like Aaron, or at least like the way that we understand their intelligence just as grammar and language. There's this assumption that the rules, the articulations, the way that language is expressed, so that we recognize it as such and recognize its structure and meanings. These rules are organized in the unconscious, and or at least on some level that we're not aware of, that we're orchestrating as we're speaking, right? So that we can allow the message to carry us through without thinking much about the structure. And you would say that, well, in the language arts, particularly as it's expressed in those ideas where one would articulate the notion, the language is at stake, right? So language poetry and David Anton agree on that. And even I agree on that. And that in some ways, any text, whether it looks like a poem or not, can be recognized as a poetics if there's a conscious, right, structuring of the elements of the language, and it's not simply to message around content, right? So once I start thinking about structure and intentionally organized structure, even the way that a novel is organized is a poetics. Now, the more one falls back upon canned ways of articulating, I used this storyboard idea and constructed this story, right? The events in this plot, based on this 1, 2, 3 model and la 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 la. Then it's pretty what I would call like idiomatically trivial. But it's still a poetics. It's a poetics of the idiomatically trivial. But okay, so Buñuel used to love this game, right? Luis Buñuel is this marvelous, Spanish and sometimes French, right? Like he's really an international filmmaker, but Spanish filmmaker who's associated with surrealism, but whose work, often, conceptually, exceeds the bounds of surrealism and is presented, typically as examples of social critique and criticism, right? So Buñuel loved this game. He would go see these Hollywood movies, and I don't remember who he played this game with, but he had it would be like David Anton and Stephen Katz, right, in this movie theater, and Buñuel and whoever this was would go watch these movies, and they had they had formulas, right, for the way that they knew what the outcomes for the movie was. So so if a blonde woman, was presented in scene 3 of this film, they say, oh, that means the hero will die at the end, or whatever it was, right? And it was kind of like a joke, but very much like this belongs to the poetic idiom of the trivial, right? So it's a formula, it's a pattern, and it doesn't necessarily just arise. It's intended, but it's so repeated and so familiar, that it loses, what the Russian formalist, referred to as estrangement, right? The making it new, and the value in the making it new and the discovery was to call attention, to what was at stake in whatever the media or medium was, whether that was language or film or some other form of representational discourse, right? And so what we do and what's at stake, has got to be more than what's inside the can. And so I want to look at these errors kind of outside that box, and utilize those errors to talk about ways that the model, both Freud's model of the unconscious and Chomsky's model of language, leave something out. And what they seem to leave out are the resources that are available, the materiality in some sense, and the material interface with the world, right? What do you begin with, right? And there's kind of an assumption that you can do anything because it is abstract. But in the arts, it's a bit different. You're always aware that you're working with physical materials, and because you're working with physical materials, there's an economics to it. But I'm going to try to argue, utilizing these errors, that even though we don't think about them as an economy, we could, right? Because the economy for Michael McClure's reading, the embodied intelligence economy for Michael McClure's reading of Chaucer is very different from the embodied resources that an individual that has dyslexia or dysgraphia or a combination of all of those things has. And so what's at stake is not only, in those instances of understanding poetic citizenship, what's at stake is not only the language, but the citizenship as well, right? And that citizenship is always dependent upon, positionalities of embodiment and the resources available, meaning whether assistive technology is available or not, or whether social understanding is available or not, right? Like in a space of social biases, oppression, bigotry, racial hatred, communicative and compassionate, empathetic understanding is a resource that's unavailable to you as a subject. And that plays into embodiment as well in multiple ways. And it does in relationship to gender issues as well, which is why, we began the discussion before we even got here with looking at, two or more ways that birds might sing that, you know, could be framed in terms of gender and other aspects of belonging to a world. So we'll progress from there, and maybe even utilize the metaphor of nests and the building of nests as a counterexample to the way that creativity is often formed as you know, coming from this sort of abstract space, right? Of that doesn't really account much, you know, for embodiment and the presence or absence of resources. If you think about creativity as nest making, it pretty clearly depends upon, you know, what you have available to make your nest with.